Guys, Cecil here once again. Hey, I wanted to do a video today and kind of touch base with you guys on a couple of things. One, the Sony conference that happened this week at Games Week in Paris. For those of you who don't know, Sony kind of had a big, kind of like a 45-minute presser to unveil some existing games, new trailers, as well as a couple of new titles. And also kind of touch base on the current state of VR and does it have much of a life? Because I know there's a lot of mixed opinions on VR in general, as well as PlayStation VR. There's also the PC side of it with like Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive. So I wanted to kind of touch on both subjects in today's video, since they're kind of related in a lot of ways. So just kind of a quick overview real quick. Sony, they kind of had a 1 hour little pre-show, and then they actually had their 45-minute actual presser, that kind of like an E3 event. And you know, though, they always do their, Sony conference around, it's the awards time next month, so they'll probably do another PlayStation event next month. I guess to me, having a conference at this Paris event kind of shows their dedication to the European market, because that's Sony PlayStation 4 especially is really big in Europe as well as North America. Consoles in general have kind of become back burner for a lot of people in Asia and Japan. Portable gaming devices and mobile are much bigger in Japan these days than, say, even 10 years ago. So I can definitely see why Sony is definitely focusing a lot of their effort on both North America and Europe when it comes to PlayStation 4. They showed a lot of indie stuff. Sony's definitely got a continued commitment to indie. They announced Guacamelee 2. They had the Gardens Between, which is kind of like this. If you're familiar with the game Brothers, but it's this brother and sister, I'm assuming, or they're friends. I guess I didn't quite understand if their familial relation. But they each have these little islands, and each has their own little like puzzle elements on each little island, and it looked kind of cool. It reminded me a lot of Brothers. And for those of you who don't know, that's a fun little co-op kind of puzzle platformer that's been out for a while. They also announced a bunch of other stuff. They showed a lot of new trailers for, the new God of War coming up, the Shadow of Colossus remaster, a new trailer for Detroit, a new trailer for Spider-Man, all really big either exclusives or timed exclusives. They announced the new Destiny 2 DLC, the first of the two that are coming out in the next several months, The Curse of Osiris. They showed trailers for Monster Hunter World, Onrush, which is this kind of car combat racing game. I believe that was one was from Codemasters, the guys who do Dirt, although don't quote me on that. I have to go back and look at the developer. They showed a new Call of Duty trailer. But I would say the overall big takeaway, the big three games they showed, were two new announcements and a new trailer for a known title. The first of the big three, in my mind, was the Ghosts of Tsushima, or the Ghost of Tsushima. This is Sucker Punch's new game. This is probably the game they've been mainly working on since Infamous Second Son, which came out in 2014. Looked phenomenal. Didn't show a lot of actual gameplay. It was a pre-rendered, real-time trailer, but at least from the aesthetic and the art style, it looks gorgeous. Definitely probably one of their big exclusives next year. Another one was a kind of a puzzle action game, I guess I would call it. It's called Concrete Genie. It definitely has a Media Molecule vibe, and for those of you who don't know who Media Molecule is, they've done the Little Big Planet series, but I don't believe they're the ones behind this one. Basically, you're this young boy, and you have a giant paintbrush on your back, and you find it, and you basically can paint buildings of all these different landscapes and creatures, and they come to life, and they have the ability to interact with the town and the areas you explore, and break open a door or bust down a wall. It's kind of a cool aesthetic. There's this group of bullies that's following the boy around, so I'm assuming there's definitely a story behind all that, but it definitely had that indie, unique, interesting style, and I just like the look of it overall. Definitely one of the more underrated, exclusive, probably coming next year for PlayStation. I guess the only downside with a lot of these games they showed were most of these were probably 2018, but at least we're getting pretty close to that now, so there's a lot to look forward to if you're a fan of PlayStation or you have a PS4. And then obviously the last of the three big things, the takeaways from the conference, was The Last of Us 2, the new trailer they showed. And given it's a Naughty Dog game, technically speaking, it is an impressive looking game to say the least. Definitely was very dark, gory. It's definitely not for the faint of heart if you haven't watched it yet. I'm sure all the trailers for this stuff is out on YouTube. But just it's come to be expected from Naughty Dog. Like The Last of Us was kind of the technical showpiece for the PlayStation 3 at the tail end of its life. The Last of Us 2 is definitely going to be, a technical showpiece for the PlayStation 4. So overall, the whole conference, just kind of to summarize it real quick, was okay. You can't expect at some kind of random mid-year conference like this, they're going to have a ton of new reveals. I'm guessing they'll probably have another event next month like they do in December, and they've done the last couple of years, and they'll show some new trailers and stuff then for their their PlayStation event around Game Awards time like they've done the last few years. I'm sure they'll probably do another one of those. But overall, not a bad conference. Definitely a lot to look forward to when it comes to being a PlayStation 4 owner. And actually, I just got a new PS4. Now, I probably haven't mentioned this. I had a PS4 from about 2014 to 2016 for about 2 years. And then last spring of last year, about 18 months ago, I sold my PlayStation 4, my white system, to help pay for the PC and stuff I have now, the setup I have to play PC games. So I haven't had a PS4 in about 18 months. And I just finally was able to do through some trade deals and stuff at work, finally got a PlayStation 4 Pro. I've wanted one of those for a while. And actually don't have a 4K TV yet to take advantage of it. I'm probably going to get one of those next spring around tax time, but I'm definitely going to set that up and at least play it pretty quick here. I missed out on a lot of good stuff in the last several months, like Horizon Zero Dawn, all the good stuff upcoming here, like the new God of War. I'm looking very forward to, so I'm definitely glad to have a PS4 back. But that kind of leads me into the other half of this video, and that's the current state of PlayStation VR. Now, overall, VR hasn't been doing too bad for Sony. It is actually the #1 selling VR headset, even compared to like Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive and all the other VR headsets that have come out in the last couple of years on the PC side. It has become the market leader, and that shouldn't be too surprising given it launched at $400 last year. It's actually come down in price down to about $300 now. Sony has a small revised version already out in Japan, and that will be coming to the US that had some minor fixes. Like the different spot for the headset jack and things like that. So probably, I guess you could call it kind of a VR 1.5, a slight revision. And they definitely showed a lot of games and support for the system. For the system just recently had its 1-year anniversary. It's down to $300. So it's definitely starting to come down in price. There's already been a lot of good games that have come out already for it. Obviously, probably Resident Evil 7 is the big, I guess, showpiece for it for people that have tried the PlayStation VR at least. I've tried it a little bit. A friend of mine has one. It definitely, if you're motion sick at all, I would not recommend it. But there's been also a bunch of other stuff that's come out. That Star Trek Bridge Crew Simulator. A lot of smaller titles on the network. There's not a lot of, one thing I've noticed working at GameStop, not a lot of VR games come to disc. A lot of the games like Rec Room and all these other indie titles and smaller titles are mainly on the network, and I don't think that helps VR as much as I think if they're trying to market it or show, hey, there's a ton of games for it. At least walking into a retail store, there's not a lot of VR games out there on disc. And I can kind of understand that to an extent. A lot of the VR games that have released are more smaller, kind of experiences, not really kind of big full-fledged games. The Farpoint VR, excuse me, I should have mentioned that one too. That was another big one that came out earlier this year. Really demonstrates with the gun accessory it comes with. It's like $80. Really demonstrates at least the potential for a first-person shooter if done well. But, you know, the VR is 1 year on. I don't have the official figures in front of me. I've looked. I believe it's already sold over 1 million so far in the last year, and probably through Christmas, it's on pace to sell probably somewhere between 2.5, maybe 3 million if there's some good Black Friday deals. So there's definitely people buying the headset, but they're not buying it in mass droves, and that's what worries me, and I'll kind of explain what I mean with that. I'm sure, unless you've been living under a rock, you've definitely seen the industry trying to hype up VR over the last few years as kind of the next quote-unquote big thing, kind of trying to replace the whole motion control gaming as, you know, the next big, sidestep on top of the traditional gaming, actually, the next big focus. I love you, Olive, too. Meow, meow. Don't mind my goofball cats. But so far, at least, if you factor in even the PC sales of headsets as well as PlayStation VR, it hasn't taken off nearly as big if you kind of lump the original Wii and the Kinect into kind of like how big that whole motion gaming in was the latter half of the 2000s and the early 2010s, how big motion gaming was for that probably 6 to 8 years between 2006 and 2014. It's kind of dead now. Microsoft has officially discontinued even making the Kinect, so I guess you can kind of say, a couple of weeks ago, motion gaming is now officially quote-unquote dead, even if the Switch's Joy-Cons do have some light motion built into it. Certain games like 1-2 VR have used motion, but it's definitely not the primary focus of the Switch like the Nintendo Wii was, or even on the Wii U. So motion gaming is now definitely, at best, a back burner accessory for all the console manufacturers. And that's, like I said before, what the industry is trying to been hyping up VR to be. And I just don't see it being there yet. It may at some point. You factor in Sony's, let's say, just for hypothetical sake, Sony sells about 2.5 million PlayStation VRs, or hell, we'll even say 3 million through the end of this year. That on paper doesn't sound like a bad number, but you got to factor in a couple of things. One, there's already over 60 million PlayStation 4 units already been sold. I think it's even higher than that, but we'll say 60 million is kind of a flat figure. That's not a huge percentage of the overall install base of PlayStation 4. And two, if you compare it to the sales for like the original Wii and the first 60 days of the Kinect, the first 60 days the 360 Kinect was out, Microsoft sold 8 million Kinects. And it's going to take VR, at least PSVR, even a long time to even come close to that 8 million stat. And Microsoft sold that in 60 days. So I don't see, at least for now, VR taking off yet. It may. And it's good to see Sony hasn't completely, abandoned it. You've got Bethesda's getting behind it with Fallout VR, Skyrim VR, Doom VR, VR versions of some of their big AAA titles from the last year. You've got that Final Fantasy 15 fishing simulator. There's the gold edition of RE7 coming out with some Chris Redfield DLC, which is free. There's Moss, which is kind of that neat little, puzzle platformer that stars a little mouse. That's kind of cool. There was also a big, was Blood and Truth is what it's called. It's kind of a stealth action spy game. Looked really cool. Like, imagine, GoldenEye 007 in VR and kind of add stealth elements to that. That's what it kind of reminded me of. There's a whole bunch of other, games like Sprint Vector, which is kind of a skating game. Kind of the graphic style reminded me a lot of, I guess, Jet Grind Radio. A little bit different stylized, but kind of as a racing game. So there are definitely VR games out and stuff coming. So Sony's not completely abandoning VR, at least in the near term. But I worry if VR doesn't continue to increase in sales, or at least maintain decent sales, if certain titles don't sell well enough, are third parties going to stick around when there are so many other games that can be made to appeal to the entire 60+ million user base of the PlayStation 4, instead of a few million people who have PSVR? and it's not selling, how long are third parties going to stick around? Sony may support it themselves for a while longer because it's their baby, but I still wonder how long third parties are going to stick around, and that's what kind of worries me in the long term for VR as kind of a consumer gaming product. It's definitely going to have applications in commercial and industrial places. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying VR is dying completely. There's a reason Facebook bought Oculus Rift for the couple $1 billion it did a few years ago. But from the consumer level, I don't know if VR is going to be quite yet. Don't mind me, my cat is attacking my gaming chair over there. But that's kind of the point I was getting at, guys, at the end of the day. I'm worried VR may not stick around in the long term, or at least developers aren't going to, if they're not seeing money in the next year or two made on a lot of the games they make for it. Or are they going to have really kind of the full-fledged AAA experiences that VR really needs to move out of the niche product phase into a broader mass consumer phase that, the Kinect enjoyed for several years? That's what's my biggest worry. And VR is starting to come down in price. If they can get it under $200 in the next couple of years, it could start selling even more. But I worry by the time it gets to a cheap enough price point, that $150, $200 level that the original Kinect was, that had a broad appeal to the mass consumer, the casual consumer base, which dominates the industry, I won't have already wondered, at least will a lot of third-party developers have moved on and not make VR games anymore because they didn't make any in the first few years. The VR was kind of the quote-unquote thing for Sony. So that's kind of my take on this whole thing. Like I said, Sony and PlayStation in general have a very, very bright future for PlayStation 4, especially going into next year. VR, I'm still a little iffy on. I haven't bought a headset yet. There are definitely some interesting games that I think aren't in the near future, in the next year, coming for it. And if the price can get down, I'm keeping my fingers crossed VR can at least enjoy some success, at least if the games sell well enough, developers will stick around long enough. Let me know if you guys watched any of the trailers or watched Sony's conference, or if let me know your thoughts on PlayStation VR down in the comments below. And as always, guys, you take it easy, and I'll see you next time.